So if you could first start by introducing yourself.
Well, good evening. I'm Rob Kaplan. I'm a forensic psychiatrist, writer, and historian, and I'm based just outside Sydney, Australia.
So a good place to start, I guess, is can you tell us about what a role as a forensic psychologist involves?
A forensic psychiatrist is a psychiatrist who is involved with anything to do with the law. It basically divides into two. There's, of course, dealing with criminals, looking at their motives. Are they sane? Can they face court? And more often than not as dramatic as that, just writing pre-sentence reports. The rest of it's what's called civil or medico-legal forensic work, and that is anything to do with the law: insurance claims, accidents, veterans affairs, government, disability grants, that sort of thing.
So who and what inspired you to become a forensic psychologist?
Well, it was a sort of transition, having started off as a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, and working in a practice. I decided this was the interest I had, and it's a very rapidly growing area of psychiatry. So I started over 20 years ago. And it also fell into the fact that I was doing a lot of writing and history, and they all seemed to come together at the same time.
Do you think do forensic psychologists primarily focus on murders, or do you use your skills in other ways to help with investigations?
You know, there's a lot of sort of misconceptions based on these television series where some sort of CSI type comes out and makes an amazing prediction and they just go out and find somebody. Look, of course, forensic psychiatrists deal with murder, but they deal with so many other kinds of crime. And if you look at the things that are hitting, well, filling up the courts nowadays, what is it? It is drug addiction, it is domestic violence, and it's child sexual abuse.
So I guess another good question to start off with is, because I feel people get this confused quite a bit. Can you explain to our listeners the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath and sociopath?
You know, strictly speaking, there isn't much of a difference. It's a question of where you got the term. Sociopath is an American term, which really refers to somebody who engages in antisocial behavior. A psychopath is a more long-standing psychiatric diagnosis that refers to somebody who's not only prone to multiple crimes, but they lack any remorse. They never learn their lesson. It's very difficult to treat them, and they're extremely manipulative individuals. So you could say there's an overlap between the two.
So it's more to do with the term than anything used in different countries, and it's similar in some aspects, but not all.
Yes, that's right.
So you're also a hold on, let me just get the thing straight. So you're also a historian and have analysed many high profile guests from the past. Which one of these was like most interesting to like look into or study?
Well, I suppose everybody's interesting, otherwise I wouldn't be writing about them. But if I look at the what's attracted the most attention has been my writing about Adolf Hitler and his doctor. There's just no shortage of people who constantly contact me and put me in documentaries and things like that.
Yeah, and of course, sort of quickly going on from that, I first came across your work on one of the Netflix series, how the Nazis lost the war. When you go into analysing it, when you go into analysing it, hold on, let me. Do you think about analysing? So obviously the series I found you on hold on, let me just read this question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about analyzing one of the most evil people in history?
Well, the first thing, of course, is you've got to know your subject very well. And it's an interesting point to make. Somebody recently wrote that there are now more books come out on Hitler than any other individual in history than aside from Jesus Christ. So you can understand the huge body of information, but at the same time, how much of it you've got to be very careful in that it's wildly speculative. I mean, some of the books written about Hitler have been quite ridiculous. There's one that claims he was a skirt-wearing transvestite who was sort of fondling all the soldiers in the trenches, for which there's absolutely no proof whatsoever, but somebody got a publisher to write a book. So the first thing is to look at all the available information and then slowly put a case together. You could make the point that, in fact, Hitler's mental state, Hitler's health, and Hitler's illnesses is almost an entire discipline in its own right. And people have been writing books about it for some decades now.
Yeah, it's quite cluttered market with books, and it probably is quite hard, and it's probably easy to look back at Napoleon in a funny way, because there's probably only a certain amount out then it's probably more accurate, whereas there's probably just it's those suspective stuff out there on him.
Look, that's probably true. Napoleon is a fixed thing. There's nobody who's going to come up with anything new about him now, so you know what you're dealing with. And the problem with somebody like Hitler, as there is with somebody like Stalin or Mao Zedong, is that there are people who just are wildly speculating and have got agendas. Well, they were bad people, but that doesn't mean you can write bad books about them.
That makes sense. So how did you touch more on the series? If people want to go and watch it, because I would recommend it. How did Hitler's mental health combine to his downfall?
Well, the basic question falls into a sort of on one side or other of a line. Was Hitler mentally ill, or did he just have certain problems? Now, the things we can exclude in Hitler is he was not mad. There are very few people of that, the sort of extreme dictators like that, who are mad. Perhaps Idi Amin in Uganda was a bit crazy. I think there's some fairly good evidence, but Hitler certainly wasn't mad. Then you've got to look at the rest of the things that he did. You might call it his behavior and his personality, and you can see how much that shaped the way he behaved. I mean, one of the strangest things about Hitler is he would spend his time lecturing everybody around him about how awful it is that they eat meat, and they should go to an abattoir and see how awful this is. And we're talking here to a man who's one of the greatest mass murderers in history. The sort of contrast never struck him. And he was a fanatic vegetarian. And one of the funniest things about Hitler that you'll see in a few of the better books is he was the most flatulent leader of the 20th century. You couldn't spend any time in Hitler's presence without having to, when he left the room, going open the windows to clear the air.
Yeah, I'd forgot which documentary, which film there was out. I think it was, I don't know, but it's about the treaty in Munich, and that even in that they portrayed that quite well, because there was a bit when he was joking and then there was an air, and then the guy didn't know if he was joking or not, and there was that very much like heavy like atmosphere, which a bit like what you said when he left the room, people opened the windows.
Yeah, it's a good movie. I enjoyed it, and that's quite accurate. There are cases for different illnesses that Hitler was thought to have had. Most of them were fairly minor, but the two commonest, shall we say, candidates. The first one is that the reason Hitler would never let any doctor examine him below the waist or around his back, or certainly around his pelvis, is that it's thought that he had congenital abnormalities of his penis. Something called hypospadias, which is a hole in your penis, and that means you always leak urine. And people could always tell when he'd gone to the toilet because he'd come back with a stain on his trousers. Now, okay, lots of people get hypospadias and these kind of things from something called spina bifida. Why was it such an issue for Hitler? Well, he is the man proclaiming the ultimate purebred Aryan, while everybody else was some kind of degenerated inferior stock. So for it to come out in public that Hitler had congenital deformities would have ruined his image. So that was one of the things that I think there's pretty good evidence for. And by the way, do you remember the old song, Hitler only had one ball?
I was just about to say that, yeah.
Yeah, and nobody knows where the song started, but it was sung in World War II. And it was only 10 years ago that they found some medical records when he was imprisoned at Landsberg jail for, I think, 13 months. And this was a kind of a turning point in his career. But to be like any prisoner, he had to have a medical exam, and he didn't manage to get back and destroy the records. And they clearly show that he was missing the right testicle. So one way or another, how they knew, I don't know, but the song got it right.
So it was all a question on from that. You sort of alluded to it earlier. There isn't really a big difference between the two. So as that's the case, what I'll ask you instead is that it. So in your eyes, what did it account? What was he? Well, I think it goes without saying that he definitely was a sociopath, doesn't it?
You know, that's a very difficult question to answer, because if you start putting a label like that on political leaders, you really start going down the scale till you've probably got your average town councillor you can call a psychopath.
Yeah.
Hitler was a monster. He was a mass murderer. He was an appalling dictator, and he seemed to have a cult of death around him. It's like the definition of what we call a psychopath is just too small to cover someone like him. The one person you can say, I think with more evidence, that he had a psychiatric illness was his matched opposite, Stalin. Now, Stalin was incredibly paranoid. He just wanted to kill anybody and everybody that in the remotest way could have been a threat to him. So I think we can say that Stalin had what we call a paranoid personality. I think there's good evidence for that.
Yeah, see, there's one thing it's not that I get annoyed about. That's probably a bit strong, but I do get why people talk about Hitler more than Stalin, but I think sometimes people forget actually what Stalin himself was capable. Obviously, people that know history will know that's different, but it amazes to me that just most people, just in, I don't know, everyday culture, just presume that Hitler was the worst, but Stalin wasn't far from that.
No, you're quite right. In fact, statistically speaking, I think Stalin killed more people than Hitler did. And Mao Zedong killed even more than both of them. But Stalin always had a sort of what you might call a lower profile in the public image. And he wasn't as, how can one put it, as dramatic a character. Everybody's seen the film footage of Hitler ranting and raving and screaming and shouting. And that sort of fits with their idea of a bizarre mass murderer. Stalin was a much more restrained character. And of course, most people have seen very little, if any, footage of what he was like in real life, which was much more restrained.
Yeah, it's just that, as what he was saying there, it's just when it comes like in conversation, and I say to people, oh, but you forget Stalin, people, and then when you say what he did, they're like, oh, did he? And then they start going, oh, actually maybe I should like put him on the same level, or some people could say even worse, but that even worse probably just because he was in power much longer.
Stalin was in power a lot longer, and yes, he probably killed more people. But what makes Hitler such an epitome of evil was that of these three people, Mao Zedong, Hitler, and Stalin, he was the only one who deliberately set out to exterminate groups of people, starting with the Jews. And had he gone on further, he would have wiped out just about most of Eastern Europe. And this was deliberate policy. And then to take it further, he had set up this thing of the death camps, which were an industrialized way of killing people instead of just lining them up and shooting them. So you can see it's very difficult to do this moral relativism between the two of them. But Stalin was a thoroughly nasty piece of work. One of his worst quotes was, one death is a tragedy, 2 million deaths is a statistic. And that's exactly sums up his thinking. It doesn't matter how many people you kill to get your ends, to get your way.
So sort of moving away from Italy, because I could talk about him for hours. Mm-hmm. Let's chat about a more recent case, a serial killer called Harold Sinman.
Shipman.
Yeah, Shipman. That's it. What do you think? What do you think his motivations were?
Well, Shipman's got this dubious distinction. It's certainly not an honor of being Britain's greatest serial killer. And just to give you the figures, when they did the official inquiry, they came up with 246 deaths, but that was conservative. And a lot of people think he probably killed 400 people. Why did he kill them? A very difficult question, but we know a couple of things about him. He had a very close relationship with his mother. And it's interesting, many serial killers do have a distant relationship with their father, but a much over-bonded relationship with their mother. And when he was 17, she got lung cancer. And he would come home every day from school and she'd be sitting there in pain. And the local doctor would come around and give her a shot of morphine or pethidine and provide her with some relief. So there's a sort of a model here that seems to have imprinted itself on his mind, that some sort of mixed feeling, probably both excitement and anger at this thought of giving somebody an injection that kills them. And this is exactly what he did with his patients. Most of the patients he killed didn't know they were being murdered. He would say, look, I'm going to take some blood, which is a perfectly standard thing for a doctor, or I'm going to give you an injection to make you feel better. And he would use the heroin that they give you in the doctor's bag at a very high dose. And within 5 minutes, they'd just lie back and stop breathing. And that was that. So that's the closest we can get to Shipman. I have one joke I make when I give talks about him to doctors, is the other thing about Shipman is that he was a cat lover. And I'm always deeply suspicious about cat lovers.
No, I'm with you on that. I'm deeply suspicious of that as well.
Yes.
Do you think, obviously it's hard for you to tell what his true motivation, so this next question will be hard to tell if he did, but obviously if he kept on killing, and do you think he would have kept on going if he didn't get caught?
There's two answers to that, or two aspects to that. Firstly, when you look at serial killers, you see that they start off slowly. It's almost like they do one killing. It's an experiment. Will I get caught? What's a better way to do it? You can even see that with Jack the Ripper, the first person he killed in Whitechapel. He made a huge mess of it. And he realized then, okay, the next killing I've got to do, because I want to mutilate them, I've got to cut their throats first so they're not struggling and throwing blood all around. So they start off experimenting, and then it gets closer and closer. It's like in a drug. They can't stop it. And it reaches a point where they feel they're losing control, and they often do something to almost get themselves arrested. Now, when Shipman got arrested, in the couple of months before that, he was killing somebody every 10 days. I mean, that is just unbelievable, horrendous to believe. But at the same time, when you look at the last person he killed, what he did was he faked her will, and she was a wealthy woman, and he did it on his own typewriter, and it looked like a 12-year-old forgery. I mean, anybody could see it was a fake. And I think there was a sort of logic, well, either I'm going to get her money and then I can scram and go, get away with it, or if I don't, well, finally it'll stop me because I've lost control of this. And that's something you do see.
Yeah, and just thinking of when you said that, I think there was a Netflix series recently about a serial killer, and he starts on cats first, and he starts on cats, and then it escalates, and it's people, and then before you know, it's like 2 people, and then it's like 10 people, and I think it's the 15th person he gets caught.
Yeah, it builds up. Now, there's a thing called the McDonald triad. And the McDonald triad is something you see occasionally in children, which is bedwetting, cruelty to animals, and fire lighting. And they have found that not every serial killer, but quite a significant number, had the McDonald triad when they were growing up. So that's something people always look for. But yeah, that's a typical story for serial killing. It's also important to say, huge attention is paid to serial killing. But in most countries, it is less than 1% of the murder rate. And 80 to 85% of murders, unfortunately, happen under your own roof with somebody you know. This is your standard domestic murder, but those aren't very sensational. So we don't hear so much about them.
Actually, going on for that, interesting question about that then. So out of in people's lifetime, how many sociopaths do people know? Is it 1 in 5 or?
No, if you read the internet, check the magazines, there's a lot of these books out, how to tell the psychopath at work, how to pick up the psychopath. I must tell you, this is just sensationalism. A psychopath, with very rare exceptions, is not somebody who functions well in society. From an early age, they start committing crimes and they can't learn from their mistakes. So they don't get very far in terms of moving up the career ladder. And it becomes evident to people around them that they are remorseless, they have no feelings, and they'll exploit anybody. You just don't become the CEO of a business if you're that disorganized. What attracts attention is this very rare category of highly intelligent psychopaths. And you can definitely put Shipman as one of those.
Yeah, as you said, there isn't, and also sort of read something from somewhere else where it said most people that are sociopaths aren't going to kill. It's if you get in the way of what they want, then if you're on the end of it.
Look, there are a lot of ruthless people around who are, very driven to get their goals, whether it's in relationships, whether it's in work, whether it's in acquisition. And probably the best way you can put it, if they are really bad at that, meaning they do awful things, is that they are psychopathic rather than real psychopaths. The other term, which I don't like, but I must be the only person in psychiatry who doesn't, is, of course, to call them narcissists. They're totally self-obsessed. They think they can do anything, and there are no rules that apply to them. And They just want to get to the top of everything. But it really is very much the same thing.
Interesting you say that. So you studied some good guys too, including Leonardo da Vinci. What can you tell us about him?
Well, I wrote a book called The Exceptional Brain and How It Changed the World. And I got a contract from a printer, from a publisher saying, look, write a book about brains. And I started writing about how brains work and sleep and pain. I wasn't getting anywhere. So then I decided, why don't I take interesting, famous, or notorious people and see what we can learn about what was there about their brain that stands out. So by the time I got to Da Vinci, I'd covered a lot of people. Hitler was, of course, one of them by then. And the first thing that struck me was he was the world's most famous left-hander. Everything he did was not only left-handed, but he did it in what's called mirror writing. In other words, it's writing that if you look at, you can't read because it's back to front. You've got to hold it in front of a mirror. Now, mirror writing is something you find in young children. You find it in mentally handicapped people who are struggling to learn how to write. And occasionally, and you find it more often in left-handed people. But until quite recently, Leonardo was the only case of a person who all his life, every single thing he wrote was in mirror writing. And that brought up a whole lot of interesting, what let's call it, neurophysiology, that people who are left-handed, genuine left-handers, tend to be much more creative. And that fitted in with the whole picture of Leonardo. So I had a lot of fun writing that.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of, I think in the last 10 years, isn't there, about people being left-handed and what it can mean in some instances.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of misunderstandings. The fact that you write, as I do, in fact, with your pen or pencil, with your left hand, doesn't necessarily make you left-handed because you might do everything else with your right hand. So the figures are constantly changing. Between about 12 and 8% of the population are genuine left-handers, and they're far more men than women. Now, there is one advantage to being a genuine left-hander, is that your speech center is on the opposite side to where it usually is. So if you're unlucky enough to have a stroke, well, you'll get all the problems with the stroke, but you'll still be able to speak, which is not a bad advantage. The other thing, and I've never really understood this, but the neurophysiologists explain that if you are doing something like playing tennis, the signal when a ball is hit at you gets to your brain quicker, and the brain gives a quicker signal to your hand to swipe the racket. So if you look, there's an astonishing number of very good left-handers are top tennis players.
I think also I'm trying to wrap my mind now, because I watch a lot of football, there's also quite a lot of, I think some of the best footballers are left-footed as well.
Well, there you go. I didn't know that, but that's an interesting point. And yeah, it would make sense.
Yeah. So let's now talk a bit about yourself. So you were born in South Africa before moving.
Actually, I was born of all places in Edinburgh, but my parents were sort of, you might say, passing through, and I only lived there for 8 months. So to be honest, I've never seen the place. I believe there are a lot of strange men with kilts there, but that's it. And so, yes, I did grow up in South Africa, and I've been living in Australia for many, many years.
What made you make that jump, or was it to do with family?
I finished medical school, internship, and even a year in the army, which was compulsory. And then I found out they'd invaded Angola, but they hadn't bothered to tell anybody, and a lot of people were coming back in boxes. And I thought this is maybe a good time to move on and see what I like and just to get away from things. And somehow, to cut a long story short, I ended up in Australia, liked it. And in fact, I did my psychiatry training here. So really, I've become part of the local scenery.
I think that anyone in your situation probably did the same, to be honest.
Yeah, I know lots of people, in fact, who went through the same trajectory as me. And a lot of them are living locally or around here.
So you've written a few pieces about the apartheid era. What was that period like as a white South African, and who didn't you agree with the policies being made?
Yeah, it was a very strange thing when I look back on it. Firstly, you lived in this highly protected society with very restricted information. I mean, people forget that the government wouldn't allow television to South Africa until 1976, the year I left the country. So all these things that most people grow up with that expose you to the world, you were cut off from. Secondly, the government's propaganda was relentless, and anything opposed to apartheid you just never heard or saw about. So you lived in this cocoon. And then I went to medical school, and well, medical school's quite tough. You really are just for 6 years, you've just got your head down trying to suck in information, and you don't pay much attention. Well, and then pretty soon after that, I left the country, and then I learned what it was all about. So any thoughts I had about going back, well, that was the end of that.
So your job and your job and studies must have taken you to some dark places. So how do you detach from these when you're not working?
Well, like any doctor, and particularly a psychiatrist, it is part of your training to learn how to deal with pretty awful things without getting too emotionally involved. You've got to be able to empathize with somebody. In other words, understand how bad they're feeling if something terrible has happened. But at the same time, you can't go away weeping and sobbing, because you just wouldn't be able to do your work objectively. So that's very much part of your training. But those people who are still prepared to call themselves my friends in public simply say that I've got a dark side, and that's why I spend my time writing about crimes and genocide and things like that. My answer is not so much that I've got a dark side, but those are the things that are waiting to be written about. A lot of the other stuff's got other people to write about it, so there's nothing I can say.
Yeah, and going on from that it is fair to say, yeah, you have got a sense of dark humor, because in your bio, you say you allegedly talk to your birds, which is it puke and puddle?
Puddle and Puke, who are sitting here in a cage now, they're sort of sleeping now, but yes, I do occasionally run things past them and they chirp back in unison.
I was going to say, what do you chat to them about?
Well, I just say, look, I'm writing about this. What do you think? And of course, they squawk or they just fly to the bottom of the cage. And I don't know, I suppose it's like talking to a mirror in some ways.
Have you got any books in the pipeline, or what are you planning next?
I've got a couple of books, what I'd say, in the pipeline. And unfortunately, I suffer from a problem probably everybody who's not a big celebrity writer does. It's very difficult to find publishers nowadays. So I've got a book called The King Who Strangled His Psychiatrist and Other Dark Tales, finished. And I just haven't had any luck with a publisher yet. In fact, if you know one, please let me know. But I think what I'm going to have to do is, like so many other people, is self-publish it myself. So that's on the agenda fairly soon.
So sort of like last question for me, really. I read somewhere that you're a little bit of a cook. If you were going to invite 3 historical figures to dinner, who would they be? who would you invite, and what would you cook them?
All right. The first person I'd invite is my favorite author, James Joyce. No question about that. The problem with Joyce, unfortunately, was he wouldn't eat meat. He would eat chicken, but no other meat. So that would make him difficult to cook for. The second person is not very well known to everybody. He's called Arthur Inman, and I wrote about him in my second book. And he was the greatest diarist in history. When he died, there were 17 huge volumes of everything every day in his life that he wrote about. And he was enormously wealthy, but he just lived in a hotel suite and never went out. People used to come in and see him. Who else would I invite? That's a tough question. Let me think. Probably Helena Bonham Carter, who just happens to be one of my favorite actresses. What would I cook for them? I would probably do a prawn risotto. That keeps everybody happy, and it's one of my favorite dishes.
Oh, fair enough. Well, thanks for agreeing to come on.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.